Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest album from Hayley Williams, Petals for Armor. This was a project I was really excited to hear because I like Hayley Williams in her band Paramore, and I especially feel like their last full-length release, After Laughter from 2017, was a really fantastic project. And I was interested to see what this album was going to have in store for us, given that it was coming after that project that I really liked, but at the same time, of course, this isn't a Paramore record, it's a solo record, and I wanted to see if this was going to be different from Paramore stuff, or if it was going to be maybe a bit more of the same, with maybe just a bit more of a personal twist to it. And overall, this is definitely an interesting project. Certainly an album that is different from anything Paramore has done before, and certainly a project that feels like a solo album. It certainly feels like Hayley Williams' own album as opposed to a group project, and stylistically it moves in a very different direction than anything that Paramore has done before. Though one thing that I did find pretty interesting is that in some regards, when it comes to the themes present here on this project, it does feel like a pretty natural continuation of what was going on lyrically on After Laughter. That record touched upon themes like depression, anxiety, failed relationships too, and this project does touch upon those things to varying extents. However, at the same time, it also introduced some tracks to this thing that talk a bit more about hope, moving on, moving forward, trying to better oneself, and even finding a nice foothold in some new relationships too. So in a lot of ways this feels, as I said before, like a continuation of some of the ideas that were present on After Laughter, just with a bit more of a hopeful twist put on them. And for the most part, I think the actual lyrics themselves here on this project are pretty solid. The delivery of the lyrics is pretty straightforward, but some of the ideas on display here and just the array of topics covered is pretty interesting for the most part. For example, I think the opening track to this thing, Simmer, has a really nice, restrained feel in the lyrics. You could tell that this track is talking about things like anger and just a lot more negative emotions and just trying to get these things under control. And, getting negative emotions under control and being able to move on from them is, like I said before, one of the big ideas here on the project. So opening up the record with a track like this, I think it's a pretty solid start thematically. Most of the more negative lyrics come towards the start of this project, and as this thing progresses, it tends to move into some more hopeful territory, which creates this almost story arc across the entire project. I'm not sure if that was intentional or not, but I think it's a pretty neat idea, and it does end up leaving this project ending off on a pretty upbeat note. Pretty much every track in the final third or so of this record seems to be dealing with some more upbeat, positive themes, stuff like finding hope, being in a relationship and some of the positive things that come along with that, trying to reimagine yourself in such a way that you could be happy in a relationship and just be happy amongst other people. All stuff that's pretty positive and upbeat, and I like the final stretch of this album quite a bit as a result of that thematically. Though I do have some complaints when it comes to the lyrics here on this project. I think that some of the tracks on this record could be maybe a bit plain when it comes to the ideas that they're trying to get across, particularly tracks like Pure Love and Taken and Over Yet, for example, are songs where I get the ideas that they're trying to get across. I think that the role that they play in the overall album and the overall arc that's being told across the lyrics here is important. It's just that the lyrics themselves in these individual tracks just don't really jump out to me in a way that strikes me as super interesting. They're fine. I can make out what's trying to go on in the lyrics perfectly fine. It's just that I wish that maybe that there was a bit more going on in them, or maybe there was a bit more of a unique twist put onto the topics that each song tries to tackle, because the lyrics in them as they are just maybe a little bit too plain for me to really get super invested in. This isn't a super big problem that I have with the record or anything like that. It really doesn't get that much in the way of my enjoyment of this thing, especially when you consider that a lot of these songs have other qualities to them that I enjoy. But yeah, that is just a minor complaint I had with this thing. When it comes to the vocal performances on these tracks, I think that they're the most consistently enjoyable part of this record. Hayley just does such a fantastic job performing on all of these songs. And I've always thought that she's been a great performer in Paramore, but a lot of the performances that she brings to this record are pretty different from any of the stuff that she did with Paramore, a bit more restrained at times, or just generally stepping out of her comfort zone. And she still does a fantastic job with all these performances too. It's quite impressive. She's able to craft so many catchy hooks and melodies across this project. And another thing on this record that I really love about her vocal performances is her ability to get across the emotion present in the lyrics of these songs just perfectly. For example, on the opening track, Simmer, you could hear some of that anger and frustration in her delivery, even though it's not a super loud, abrasive delivery or anything quite like that. In fact, it's quite restrained, but you could hear that anger and tension just under the surface of that delivery, and it perfectly gets across what the song is trying to talk about. When it comes to the instrumentals here on this project, they're definitely one of the more interesting aspects of this record, and certainly one of the aspects of this thing that's most different than anything Paramore have done before on their records, mostly because whereas Paramore are a pop rock and pop punk group, the sound of this record is a fair bit different. You have this kind of art pop sound going on in this thing. Of course, some tracks do have this rock influence to them, but it's a lot more restrained and artsy compared to anything Paramore had done in the past. The closest comparison I can make is that maybe some of the tracks on this thing have a bit of a sound similar to some of the tracks off After Laughter when it comes to that kind of upbeat, happy but really not happy sound to them. Tracks like Dead Horse, for example, or even some of the tracks in the very end of this record, though, like I said before, all those tracks tend to be pretty upbeat overall, so I guess it kind of makes sense to pull that sound back for those songs. Regardless, the sound of this record overall is pretty eclectic, and there are certainly some tracks on this thing that diverge a lot from the core sound of this record for one reason or another. Take, for example, the track Sudden Desire that appears in the first third of this project. Certain parts of this thing have the core sound of this record, the kind of restrained art pop sound, but there are moments on this track that have this noisier feel to them as well, particularly during the hook of this track. Certainly something unique for Hayley, certainly something unique for this album too, and I actually quite like the result that you get here, and I think that this is actually one of the more memorable tracks on this project, especially when you combine that pretty interesting production with one of the catchier hooks on this record. The track Sugar on the Rim is a song that sees Hayley experimenting with this kind of funky, electronic, danceable sound, different than anything else on the project. Really a lot of these songs in the final third of this thing, as I said before, kind of have this sort of upbeat, danceable feel to them, but I think this track takes it to a completely different level in a way that I think really pays off nicely, as this just ends up being, yet again, one of the most memorable and unique songs on the entire project. And again, a big part of that also has to do with the fact that this song has a really fantastic hook and some of the most interesting lyrics on the entire project, in addition to a really fantastic performance on Hayley's part. But the instrumental and the general sound that this track is going for is also super unique and cool. However, while I quite like a lot of the instrumentals on this project, I do think that there are a few here or there on this record that maybe could have used a bit more unique personality to them, maybe a bit more development to make them a little bit more interesting. Not to say that any of the instrumentals here are bad necessarily, I just think some of them are a little underdeveloped, kind of like some of the lyrics on this project at certain points. And for the most part, it's really never that big of a deal, because often on these tracks where the instrumentals are maybe a bit lacking, the lyrics happen to be particularly interesting and the vocal performances tend to be quite good too, so it kind of makes up for it. But yeah, just another minor complaint I had with this project is that maybe a few of the instrumentals here or there could have been used just a little bit more to them. Also, while I do quite enjoy a lot of the odder moments on this thing from a production standpoint, some of the odder instrumentals on this thing do lead to this project having this kind of uneven feel when listening to it from start to finish, just because while there is a pretty consistent core sound to this thing for the most part, every so often you'll just get this odder track that just kind of feels like a tangent that's never really returned to. And while I do enjoy a lot of these moments, they do, like I said before, lead to this thing feeling kind of jumbled and uneven at certain points. It's not a terrible fault with this project by any means, because, like I said before, lyrically this project is really consistent, and when it comes to the performances on this thing, they're really enjoyable. And a lot of the instrumentals on this thing, despite feeling, kind of jumbled at certain points, they are still really enjoyable, so it's never that big of a deal. But still, I do think the overall listening experience of this project can feel a little all over the place at certain points. So overall, Petals for Armor is a pretty enjoyable record. I think a lot of the production on this thing is quite entertaining. I think the lyrical themes and ideas covered here are quite nice, especially when you look at it as a whole and see the entire arc that's being told here across this record. I think Hayley's vocal performances on this thing are just fantastic overall, easily the strongest thing about this record overall. It's just a pretty enjoyable solo record, and it certainly showcases that Hayley can do a ton outside of Paramore. And while I'm certainly excited to see what Paramore decides to do in the future, I'd be pretty happy to see what Hayley would do on her own on a second solo album too. Personally, I don't enjoy this quite as much as After Laughter, but I do think it's still a pretty solid record, and for fans of Hayley, for fans of Paramore, or for anyone out there looking for some pretty enjoyable pop or alternative rock styled music, this is certainly a record that I would recommend to you, and it's one that I think a lot of people will find some enjoyment in. So yeah, overall I'd recommend this project, but that is just my own personal opinion when it comes to this album. If you happen to disagree with anything I've said here, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own thoughts on this album in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like album reviews, countdown lists, discussion videos, things of that sort. Again, thank you guys for watching this video, and stay golden.